Brendon.
Howdy.
So I just finished watching your film and it was amazing. Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much for making the film, producing it, directing it. And yeah, I want to know how did you arrive to wanting to make the film?
Well, when it comes to filmmaking, that's something I want to do since I was 14. So the subject matter was something I discovered in my early 20s as I was starting my own journey of self-development. And I felt like that this was a subject that was really important and that had not been talked about much, which actually the last episode of my podcast I did was on effective altruism, which is, one of the ideas in that is seeing places that are there's not as much focus on them, but you could do a significant amount of good. And I felt like this was something where there wasn't a lot of focus, but it was really important because it affects everyone so personally. It affected me very personally. And so that was a place that I could do a disproportionate amount of good.
Were you a father yet when you made the movie?
No, I was in my early 20s. I have a almost 2-year-old now. And part of the reason I use this particular microphone that I do is that it's very directional. So if I go off microphone just a little bit, you almost can't hear me, and that's deliberate because in a little bit, someone might wake up from his nap, and when he starts playing with mom, then he won't show up on the podcast audio. So
Yeah, it's all good. Yeah,
yeah,
I get it. Yeah, I think even my I don't know if this one has it, like voice isolation.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how to turn it on, but yeah, it's sometimes you can even hear like the toilet flush on this, so I don't know how to turn it off. But yeah, it's all good. So, okay, so you're a father. Your son's almost 2 years old. Yeah, for me, I think I really am passionate about sharing with mothers and parents, but it wasn't until I became a mother myself where I I didn't think about circumcision, but I was entering motherhood, asking other moms who just gave birth to a boy, and the first thing I thought was like, so did the doctor ask you if you want to circumcise? Are you going to? And I know in your film American Circumcision, you focus on the culture in America about circumcision, but it was really interesting with my two cousins. My parents are from Thailand. My cousins are Thai, and they recently they each had a son. And I had to ask them, I was like, are you going to circumcise? And they said yes. And I said, why? And I started sending them all of these articles and stuff like that, like really hoping that they wouldn't. And it's just unfortunate. The first thing both of them said was like, it's cleaner. And so, I mean, I think we're going to hop around topics, but can we talk about like these myths that circumcising your son is cleaner when that's not the truth?
It's really bizarre. It's a thought terminating cliche. So when you start getting into like, well, what do you mean cleaner? Like, is the male body dirty? Is sexuality dirty? I'm surprised having family from there that they would. I mean, are they in America now?
No.
That's surprising. Because as I understand it, it's not a big part of the culture there, but I guess they've been Americanized in a certain way. Is that
Yes.
what's interesting?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's
Everything
what
from America is like highly
Mhm.
valued or revered in Thailand.
I see. Yeah, it's interesting. It's one of the if you talk to people in America about American culture, we're much more critical of it. I'll put it that way. Um, in America, that this idea is not there. So I think that's more so a foreign perception of America, and that foreign perception may not have caught up to things as they actually are in America. But the concept of cleaner dates all the way back to the Victorian era. So in circumcision began as a medical practice during the Victorian era, and as a cure, it was promoted as a cure for masturbation. So the idea during the Victorian era was that sexuality, according to them, was somehow dirty and unclean, and that when they used the term hygienic or cleanliness, they were also speaking about it in a moral sense. They were saying this is somehow morally better, morally cleaner. And it's one of those sort of vestigial cultural phrases that people still use today, but they don't have the same ideology behind it. So when people say that, it's almost like I don't know if you've seen the movie Idiocracy, but it's like it's got what plants crave. Oh, see, so it's a film about a far future where everyone's intelligence is severely dropped and they only speak in such thought terminating cliches. So, but it's a similar thing where people make that claim and then they haven't really unpacked it or looked at it. And I think that most people's values are that the natural body and natural sexuality is good or healthy in some way, and most people wouldn't want part of that cut off of them. So I think most people's values are more aligned towards protecting their children, towards keeping them intact. It's just that there are these sort of dominant cultural phrases that have been promoted throughout the world, in large part due to American power, basically around the world. And when you actually start to question them, there's a different picture.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I was shocked with that. And then I did have a friend who's American Vietnamese, and her doctor did ask her, like, right when, a few days or, a day after birth, she was still in the hospital. And I said, oh yeah, so did the doctor ask you? And she's like, yeah, I'm thinking about it. And I was like, I sent her all this information and she opted out.
Yeah,
so
that's great.
I think, because I'm in, the world of mothers, I think more mothers are waking up to the effects, the harm of, and I know you want to talk about language too. What do you think if I begin to, instead of saying circumcision, male genital mutilation? Is that appropriate? Should I say that?
I mean, it's an accurate description. The term that I often use is male genital cutting, because mutilation is accurate, but also is usually perceived as a value judgment. Whereas, if people object to male genital cutting, like, okay, well, what part of that do you think is inaccurate? Like, is there not cutting? Is there not male genitals being cut? That is a term that is accurate, but it does sort of cut through the cultural conditioning, so to speak.
Okay, so I'll say male genital cutting.
But I mean, honestly, mutilation is true. I mean, with all of the language, it kind of depends on your audience and their values, right? So your friends who want to be Americanized or adopt American things because they see that as somehow better or high status, the language I would use with them is different than the language that I would use with someone who has a very negative view of American culture or whose values are, what you could describe as like crunchy or holistic. And it's different than I would speak to an academic, because I sort of believe in using the language that people will understand. And sometimes there is a precise thing you need to communicate and there's a word for it and we have to use that particular language. But a lot of the time when you're talking to someone, it's about your audience and what they'll receive as much as what you have to give.
So I would say the audience that are watching this or listening to this are more women who are on the crunchy side, living in America. Yeah. 24 to the age of 34. I mean, mamas or first time moms. But yeah, and it's really interesting because even when I put, a poll on my Instagram on whether, what their thoughts are on circumcision, I had some women come forward saying with their firstborn, they did. And they're traumatized by it. They regret it. Can we bust some myths about circumcision?
It's challenging there because you're sort of playing whack-a-mole with these myths, right? And some of them are extremely contradictory. So people say, well, it's a cultural thing, or it's my religion. And they'll say, well, it's a medical thing. It's cleaner. There's science. And it's like, oh, hold on. Like, it can't both be a faith-based religious thing and something that you're making a purely rational scientific. Like, these are completely different discourses, completely different values. And people will throw out objections like, well, I think it prevents this disease. Like, are you at risk for this disease? Is your child going to get something sexually transmitted before the age of 18? Like, what are our values here? And so the challenge of the myths is that there's a lot of really surface level thinking around them. And I think that surface level thinking and the sort of thought terminating cliches are intended to prevent the deeper thinking of, like, what actually are your values as a parent? What's important to you? How do you want to raise your children? Do you want to teach them that if someone's bigger and stronger than them, they can just cut parts of their body off? Do you want to teach them that they're perfect and loved and whole just the way that they are? Do you want to have a relationship um, where you make decisions for them on the basis, well, that they'll never find out about those decisions later, they'll never actually become a full adult who's informed and aware of their body? And do you want them to question the cultural values around them and be able to make decisions for themselves? Like, these are the deeper questions that I think anyone who becomes a parent should really concern themselves with and should be focused on, not these sort of, surface myth, thought terminating cliches. And so in my film and in the stuff I've written, I go through all of those. The first sequence, for example, just looking at the studies around HIV and circumcision, was like an hour when my first edit of that. The short version, by the way, is that in those studies, one group used condoms at a higher rate than the other, which are really actually condom studies if you actually look at them. But that, I don't think, is actually why people are making their decisions. They're making their decisions on things that are not rational. They're actually really personal and relational. And then the rationalizations and the headlines come later as a sort of defense, because it doesn't sound as good to say, well, we made this decision because the idea that my parents did something to me that was bad makes me really uncomfortable. And I want to feel like my body and my sexuality is perfect just the way that it is. My ego's really fragile, and I can't handle anything that might suggest otherwise, especially if it's one that makes me feel powerless or out of control. And so I'm just going to glaze all that over and not look at this. And here's a headline, it's cleaner, right? Like, that's, if you were to, like, sort of put a lasso of truth around them, an honesty serum, like, that is what would come out, is that sort of rationalization and thinking. And that doesn't sound as good as the rationalizations, as the sort of headlines, the myths, when the truth is very simple, that the human body is perfectly functional the way it is. Every mammal has a foreskin. Most cultures keep their children intact, and they're perfectly fine for it. That part of the body, the foreskin, has the most nerve endings of any part of the male body. It performs an important function in the body, including an important function for sexuality. And you can basically leave it alone and the child will be fine. So the truth is very simple. It's that the lies and distortions become complex. And part of there's something I've heard, which is that when you are looking at truth or talking to someone who is a good person or wants you to have the truth too, that the longer you talk to them, the clearer things become. Because people who are doing something good, they want you to understand, even if what they're doing is complex or it takes a bit to understand. You're going to have a greater understanding the more you talk to them. But one of the signs that of talking to someone about who might actually be sociopathic or doing something wrong is that the longer you talk to them, the more confused you become. So someone who is doing something wrong isn't going to want you to know that they're doing something wrong. And that confusion is going to be something that they use to keep you from understanding what they're doing. And I feel like with this issue, the longer you look at the various excuses and myths and things that people have used to promote touching children's genitals, cutting young children, infants, the more confusing their excuses become. So you hear one headline, you're like, oh, it prevents this disease. Okay, that sounds good. And you ask more, like, well, how was the study done? Do those studies justify cutting all children or just one gender? Okay, but you said there was gender equality, and like, how does that work? Okay, but this is different here. How? Oh, it's because of a religion. Wait, but religion doesn't work that way in our culture. Like, the more questions you ask of that sort of perspective, the more confusing it becomes. Whereas the truth is incredibly simple. It's just like, don't cut body parts off of children. That's it. Like, the end. Um, it's that simple.
Mm-hmm.
But the myths themselves are sort of designed to be confusing, and part of the challenge of disentangling them is that you're having the experience you'd have if you were disentangling the testimony of a sociopath or a liar, of like, you have to really just dig into their lives, and the more you dig in, the more they create.
Yeah, I agree 100%. That's a good way of looking at it. Well, one thing what I learned as I started researching, if I were to share it with my cousins, or even my mom, telling her like, why did you get my brother circumcised, and she would just say, oh, like, he didn't feel it. However, they definitely did. And watching 2 minutes of a baby in your film getting male genital, his genitals cut, it was really hard to watch. And I had to watch it. I needed to I mean, just to experience, and I cried. It's so hard hearing the baby cry and
Yeah.
them experiencing the pain. Babies feel pain. They are human. And I think it's such an excuse saying that babies don't feel pain, that they're like these robots that come out of, women's vaginas.
Yeah, it's a bizarre myth. And I think what people mean when they say that is that they cannot articulate their pain in adult language. And there's an incredible bias that the dominant society, that people have towards adult language. And I think that childism, adultism, whatever you want to call it, that sort of pervades everything in society, where there is a bias. If you look at social justice literature, they say that dominant groups sort of demand that people they're oppressing speak in their language. And I think that there is a similar relationship between adults and children, where adults expect children to communicate using adult language, and often ignore any testimony that doesn't come in that language, when children are incredible at their expressing themselves. I mean, before my son had language, he has language now, and he's very good at it. He's ahead of most kids his age in terms of his ability to communicate. And I think that's partly because me and my wife, his mom, we listen to him and encourage the communication, and also try to bridge the gap. So sometimes he doesn't have the word for something, and we have to be a bit of detectives trying to figure it out, because he's only a 1-year-old now. But even before then, he's very good at communicating his feelings. It's just that what he's communicating isn't adult narrative, intellectual. It's his feelings, but he's so good at communicating his feelings. And even an infant on the first day of its life is good at communicating its feelings. If an infant is upset, it will make you feel upset. If an infant is happy or thinks something is funny, it will make you laugh so hard and fill you with such joy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So infants are incredible communicators of their feelings. It's just that adults often have a bias towards a particular style of communication. I'll add to, you mentioned the scene in the film where we show circumcision. There's a reason there's a warning before that scene that says exactly how long it's going to be, and tells the audience, and it's because the first version of that scene, first of all, the procedure itself often takes like 15 minutes or 20 minutes, right? So the first edit of that scene was like 5 minutes, and no one was ever going to make it through that. And then I made it much shorter, and I found even if it was shorter, people wouldn't make it through, because they didn't know how long it was going to be, right? Like, they don't know if I'm about to spring like a half-hour scene on them, right? So I put a thing, I did, quick title card being like, this is the procedure only takes this long, but we're only going to show you 2 minutes, because then people would know, like, okay, like I can handle it for that amount. And even then, it's also a warning, because some people don't want to see that. And at every live screening we did, there were usually 1 or 2 people who stepped out of the theater for that, and I understand it. But then they knew, okay, I'm gonna close my eyes for 2 minutes, I'll step outside, and then I'll come back and see the rest of the film. So there's a reason there's a warning for it. But it's telling too that most people can't watch it, but they also expect a newborn infant to endure it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Incredible. I don't know if I would say double standard, because our expectations is that adults are the ones who can endure things and be strong, right? And like no one expects a baby to, and in fact, a lot of our language is, oh, you're acting like a baby, as if um not being able to do things is characteristic of babies, right?
Mm-hmm.
They have no patience for anything.
Yeah. I think it is important to watch it because it is the reality. It's the reality on what occurs. You got great reviews on Amazon on your movie.
Thank
How
you.
did
Yeah.
you, after the movie, what has changed now? I know you have a show.
Podcasts, I wrote some books, all sorts of things. I have a Substack, hegemonmedia.com. I've been doing a lot. I think that you're asking about like 5 years of history, and my mind just like went through all of it. 5 years of history. Let's see. 4 books, two of which have really nothing to do with this issue at all. They're just because I like creating things.
Where can we find the Intactivist Guidebook and Children's
That's on
Justice?
Amazon.
Oh, that's on
Yeah.
Amazon. Okay.
And that book is not so much about the issue as it is about the process of activism. So after I made the film, I had a lot of people asking me, okay, I saw this, I want to get involved. What should I do? And the thing that I noticed is that my thinking creating the film was that I noticed I was having the same conversation over and over with people, and they all kind of say that, isn't it cleaner, and then what about this, and then do they feel pain? And I got tired of having the same conversation person to person, one at a time, because I'm naturally introverted. I like writing, I like making art. And so I thought, well, if I could have a way to like scale that conversation, because I was reading all these things online, and when I would back when I did the film, I would tell people, oh, how can I learn? Where can I learn more? It's like, well, there's like 3 different really long academic books on Amazon that I recommend, and there's like a dozen websites that look like they were made with 1995 HTML, and you can watch these grainy YouTube videos, and it's like no one was going to go through all that. So I thought, okay, I need to present this in a way that people will actually hear. I'd wanted to make films since I was 14, and I had a talent for that, and so I thought, okay, well, I'll put everything that I've learned together into something that people could actually watch, and that will actually take them on a journey through all of this information. And so that's what I did. And after the film was done, I what I noticed is that people would be like, oh, I want to do something. I'll stand on a street corner with a sign and protest. And I thought, that's kind of what I was trying to avoid by making the film. Like I wanted the talking one person to person at a time. And I think there is a place for that type of activism, but it's not the only thing people can do. And what I noticed is that I'd also talk about say, oh, I want to do something, but I don't like protesting. It's like, that's not, there's so many things you could be doing. So the book is kind of about that of okay, you care about this issue, what do you want to do? Like, how can you get involved? What will actually work? And to write the book, I read tons of different books on activism from other movements, not just about this issue, but the process of activism. And I immersed myself in several other movements that I thought were successful, and I looked at what they were doing. Uh, so a lot of the books that I read and the things that I studied were from people who did like anti-war stuff and union work. And I realized listening to them that there's a process to activism, similar to how there's a process for anything, right? Like there's a process for building a media company or podcasting. There's a process for starting a business, and that activism has a process to it too. And actually, if you just do person to person, one person at a time without ever doing any organizing, that actually won't solve the issue. That won't get you all the way there. You have to at some point organize in some way and build power in some way, and go through a whole process that I talk about in the book. So that's what that book is about. And it's basically a long letter to the people who I knew working in the movement, to the people who I knew through my film, to the people who saw my film, everyone who asked me, okay, so what should we do? The book is intended to answer that. And it's also one of those things where I think it's reflected, my thinking has continued to evolve and change on that. I did another follow book called Children's Justice, where I looked at basically the ideas of social justice movements and started applying that to this issue. Because I've obviously noticed, social justice, huge impact in the world. And I noticed that those movements were doing extremely well. And I thought, okay, well, what are they doing that children's movements for the rights of children, for supporting children, are not doing? And there was, a whole 100,000-page book I wrote answering that question. So, but the short version is that they have a completely different way of thinking about the issues, and that the ideas, the theory behind them were a part of their success, and that theory, if applied to children's issues, one, it could be applied. In fact, it fits incredibly naturally. If social justice is about protecting oppressed people, well, children are the most oppressed group in every society around the world through all of recorded history. And they're also at a disadvantage. They don't have the same access to language and social power and all of the things that we do. And they have incredible needs. And every other system in society is in some way a product of the negative ways in which we treat children. So if you want to solve any other social justice issue, the quickest way to do it is actually just to raise children who are loved and who don't have the emotional patterns that would lead to someone participating in those other issues. So that's what that book is about. It's applying those ideas to the way that we treat children and to children's activism. And a lot of it, like you mentioned earlier, is around language. So obviously social justice movements have very particular ideas around language. And one of the things that I discovered writing the book is this concept of power knowledge, this idea that any system of power is built on language. So, I mean, even your friends wanting American ideas or American products in some way, that is what political theorists would call a form of soft power, that there's this cultural power that is influencing other societies where, America might not be directly taking over the country, but there's this way in which their culture, their cultural hegemony, their ideas are creeping into that society, even down to ideas about what body parts on your children you'd keep. And that's all through language. That's not, it's not actually anyone with guns making anyone do anything.
Hmm.
So
Wow.
anyway, so those are the other projects that followed the film.
I love your reflection on that because when I think about raising children, I'm shifting from becoming a personal trainer to becoming a birth attendant, birth keeper. And it does start with how babies are born, even. And I'm totally against, birth is not a medical event. I did not engage in the industrial obstetric system when my child was born. He was born at home with just me and my husband. And I think that is where it starts. And if women give birth at home outside the medical system, it can already start there because there is no coercion of the question. Like if you were in a hospital on day one, where the doctor comes up to you after your baby is born saying, would you like to circumcise your child? Because
You're bringing me back to sorry, go ahead.
Well, so no woman who had a home birth is really going to go in and say, I would like to get my son circumcised. I mean, I don't know the data on that, but I'm pretty sure a lot of crunchy mamas wouldn't do that.
Yeah, it's a different culture. It's a different cultural norm. And you're reminding me, so that when the parents who've experienced that, I've heard them refer to themselves as regret parents, because they feel like they made this decision that they regret. In my book, I use the term coerced parents, because I don't think the dynamics there are ones where they made a totally free and independent decision. Like the parents in that situation did not train medical doctors in medical schools to do the procedure. They didn't manufacture the devices that are used to do it. They didn't build a sales funnel around birth where all of these other interventions are part of that sales funnel. they didn't ask they weren't didn't have someone decide to have someone ask them with using high pressure sales tactics 8 to 9 times to do the procedure. They were given a form that one of the hospital's lawyers, I'm certain, wrote, that had a place where they signed, and then they signed one piece of paper, and the hospital and the medical system sort of scapegoats parents on that and says, well, you made the decision, ignoring all of these other factors around it, right? And often the decisions made while the parents are still under the influence of, or the mom is still under influence from, drugs from giving birth. And it's like, well, in any other situation, if someone, quote unquote, consented after being asked something 8 or 9 times while under the influence of drugs, we would not call that consent. We call it coercion, especially given the power dynamics between parents and doctors. And I don't know that there is, I mean, there's obviously no consent for the child, but I don't even know if there's consent for the parents in that situation. So I think if parents take their power back, not just on this, but on a whole host of issues, and raise children in a way in which they are free from trauma, in which they're loved, that solves a whole host of other social problems. That's actually the most important thing we could be doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think supporting the parents, educating them fully on even why it's not necessary and what the doctor is saying. And I think if that was even given on a piece of paper, I think majority of parents would opt out. But no doctor is really going to say, I'm going to ask, but it's really not necessary.
Yeah, and part of the challenge with education is that a lot of the time, like, to be countercultural in any culture, you have to educate yourself because the norms of that culture are not on your side, right? And so this isn't like, a lot of the people I talk to about this issue are from that holistic world. They're from they're in things like natural birth. They're shifting their perspective around a whole course of things, and I love that culture every time around. It's good. I spoke at a conference on natural birth recently, and um, like, I think that cultural shift is in some way easier to make than staying in the dominant culture while trying to be of a different culture in it. In other words, when I would talk to a lot of people in the intactivist movement, the movement against circumcision, who are still working as doctors or nurses or involved, they're like, okay, well, they're going to ask you this, and you have to say no to this, and then they're going to try to bully you with this intervention. You have to say, it's like, it's so much easier to just not be there in that environment. It reminds me, there's a study done of Vietnam vets. A very significant portion of people in Vietnam used hard drugs like heroin, and then when they came back home, they stopped using. And the rate of that drop off of people stopping using heroin when they left Vietnam is greater than any rehab program. So it shows that if you actually want to change your behavior around something, the easiest thing to do is change your environment. And it turns out, people feel like they need drugs less when they're not in the middle of the Vietnam War, right? And I think it's similar, where a lot of the things that we're trying to change are the result of a culture and environment, and it's actually easier to change the whole thing than it is to try to change a little piece of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes me think of with women who have engaged in the medical system while they're pregnant. Once they step into that OBGYN's office and going in saying, I'm not going to have an ultrasound, I'm not going to have an ultrasound, and then waiting in the doctor's room, and the doctor says, would you like to have one? Or, oh, we got to check you. They say yes.
Yeah.
Because they're already in that environment, and then they're engaged, and now they think something might be wrong with their baby, and then they're even deeper and deeper versus with me and coaching women when they get pregnant. It's kind of like, just don't engage at all, because you will get sucked in, and then your decisions after that is going to affect everything from birth and your pregnancy.
It sounds like the challenge of, like, I'm just gonna eat one potato chip. Like, it's easy, it's easy to have the whole thing, it's easy to just not, but that middle ground is actually the hardest position, because you're not really committed to either, and it's just easier to commit to one or the other. And I I appreciate having a wife and people in my life who are committed to a very different way of being.
Can we touch on like the history? Because I get a lot of people who've commented when I do, keep your baby whole and intact. It's kind of like, it's so crazy. Like, why this is happening? It's like, no, if you know how we got here, it makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like the history. So, oh man, so the talk I gave at this birth symposium was all about the history, and there's multiple layers to this. I'll do the medical history first because that's the one that is probably more pertinent. But the uh, circumcision began as a quote unquote cure during the Victorian era for masturbation. The Victorians thought that circumcision was the cause of many social and moral ills, that it was harmful. The idea that it's cleaner, more hygienic, like goes back to this Victorian idea. And I, for the longest time, I thought, okay, this must like Victorians were crazy. We modern people are so much more enlightened, and like this was just people in the past being weird and uneducated, right? And then I read some more history of the time, including a history of this era from the French philosopher Michel Foucault. What he talks about in his work is that actually the Victorians knew what they were doing. These people weren't stupid. They knew you could never stop people from masturbating. They knew this was an impossible task, but it massively expanded the power of the medical system. So they had this thing that was obviously just a part of everyday life that everyone does. It's totally normal and natural, and they pathologized it and medicalized it. And at the time, they wanted power basically over children, and at the time, parents had power over children, but governments and people in power were starting to see that they couldn't just have power over you know sovereign power over killing people, but actually if they could increase their population, if they could encourage there to be more people, they could have more power. He calls this in his work biopower, as opposed to sovereign power. Sovereign power is the king saying off with your head, and biopower is the ability to not just decide who dies but who lives. So okay, we can extend people's lives, we can encourage certain people to procreate more. uh, and at the time, parents had power over children. So if by creating this problem of masturbation, they basically made parents agents of the doctor. So you have to watch your child. They say that you should watch your child, make sure he doesn't do this. But the moment he does, there's a problem that you as the parent can't solve. You have to call the doctor, right? And reading some of the things that doctors at the time did is very creepy. And as a modern person, I can't help but think that there wasn't some sexual abuse going on here. So like there's stories of like a doctor spending the night in the child's bed to make sure he didn't do this, right? And as a modern person, I'm like, absolutely not. Like there's no way that there isn't something wrong going on there. But what it essentially did is it made children something that the medical system had power over. And even now that sort of continues today, right? Like, ask your pediatrician. You as a parent essentially bring your child to this agent of a system, and then they evaluate and see how the child is doing and tell you, they're the one who can solve the problem. And you as a parent are essentially not the expert on your child, they are. And so there's this whole system whereby the medical system gains power over children through that. And the campaign against masturbation, basically, according to Foucault, according to some historians at the time, wasn't them just being crazy, it was them gaining power. And you can actually, by the way, see this a similar thing today. If you take something that is relatively normal, like say a flu virus, and then you massively expand power over society through that, then it might look like people are going crazy, when what's actually happening is that there is a system that's gaining power. And I'm certain that people will look back on our time and think, wow, like those people in the 2000s were so crazy. They thought that if you wore a mask over your face from the front of the restaurant to your seat and then immediately took it off to start eating, you could not get sick. They were so crazy back then. But of course, we all know, like, that doesn't actually prevent anything. That was something that was done because of power, because of basically as a form of social control.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a similar thing that went on with this campaign against masturbation, where they know that you can't stop people from masturbating. They know it's totally natural. There's some people who at the time, like just like today, they're probably really hysterical about it, and they're crazy. They've bought into the propaganda essentially. But there's also a larger group of people, especially involved in the profession, who know that this is giving them more power. And if you look at the medical system, this is a pattern of, well, whatever will increase medical power is the treatment. In other words, I saw an article recently saying that the American Academy of Pediatrics was considering prescribing medication and surgery for childhood obesity. It's like, well, we have a natural cure for obesity. We have a natural cure for childhood obesity, but that doesn't expand medical power, right? That would actually mean reducing the power of, say, the food industry or various industries engaged in, pollution in our environment and chemical pollution. It would mean maybe lifestyle changes, but these are things that don't expand medical power. So the solution they pick is the one that does expand medical power. And if you look at every sort of solution that the medical system proposes, one I brought up in my talk was even around gender issues. So at one point, the medical system said that the solution to gender issues was to lobotomize and electroshock therapy people who had any kind of different gender identity or sexuality. Now, and of course, there are stories that they've become much more progressive, that they've seen the error of their ways. Now they propose surgery and puberty blockers for people who have any kind of different gender identity or sexuality. And it's kind of like, I don't think they care either way. I don't think that they're essentially have had any sort of moral shift around being more accepting of people with different sexualities or gender identities. It's just they were going to sell you the medical system as a solution for this thing, and they'll sell you the medical system as dressed up as a different solution for this thing. It doesn't actually matter to them what solution, whether they accept people of different sexualities or genders or anything like that. What matters to them is that they can make a profit off of it.
Yeah.
And so if they can make a profit by not accepting them and treating them very cruelly, or they can make a profit by saying that the best way to affirm those things is by selling you something, then they'll do that. It kind of doesn't matter. And if you go through every medical and quote unquote medical solution, they all sort of function the same way. And by the way, it's true, even if the solution is a good thing or not, that is their function around it. So, I assume that there are some things where you really do need some medical intervention, and they're going to be there to sell it, and they're definitely not going to tell you anyway that you could have avoided a situation where you really did need it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So
But I know I touched on 20 other topics that didn't have to do with our primary thing, but
well, tell me if I got this wrong. So watching your film, and I am probably messing this up, but even with for religious reasons, when parents were circumcising their child, it was only the top of the foreskin, right?
yeah. So the version of circumcision that became medicalized was Jewish circumcision. And Jewish circumcision changed during the Hellenistic period. So there was a version of circumcision that removed less tissue, that was done back in the time of Abraham and Moses. And by the way, one of the interesting things about that is I think a lot of people have the misconception that Judaism essentially invented it, but in the biblical texts, they propose the idea as if it's something that already exists in the culture. Interestingly, by the way, the verse that introduces it says, circumcising everyone in your house, including your slaves. So, the assumption there is like, oh, look, we all already support this slavery thing, but let me tell you about this new idea I've got that we can add on top of the slavery. Um, and so the original version of circumcision was different. And then during the Hellenistic period, Jewish men wanted to participate in Roman athletic games, which were done in the nude. And so it would have been considered very lewd to have that part of the body exposed, because the only time that happens for a man is when he's erect or aroused or something like that. And so the behavior would have been like, essentially someone going around with an erection the whole time. And so to avoid that, Jewish men pulled the remaining foreskin they had forward and made it look like they were intact. And the rabbis at the time, the Jewish leaders, did not like that men were trying to assimilate to Roman culture, and so they changed the way that circumcision was done to remove more tissue, remove not just the very end of the foreskin, but the entire foreskin. And so that version became the version that exists today in medicalized circumcision. But it's also one of those things too where people will say, oh, that's one of the thought terminating cliches. People, well, it's in the Bible. It's like, actually, the version we do today is not. That's something different. The version we do today is more part of rabbinical Judaism, or the later version of Judaism that came after that early Old Testament period.
When my son was 4 months old, he actually got infant botulism from like inhaling dirt and spores, and we went to the hospital, and the doctor and the nurse saw that he was intact, and they were telling me, the mom, how to clean my son's penis by telling me that I need to retract his foreskin. And I had to say it instead of saying, oh, okay. I was like, no, I learned that you're not supposed to. And then the doctor, Dr. Zuckerman, was like, oh no, you need to, because he can get phimosis. And then after he leaves, the nurse is like, you just gently retract it. And I was like, no. And it's just so funny because it's not correct. And my mom, who's been an OR nurse for 30 years, as well, like being in the medical system, she thought you had to retract it too. But that is not what you do to a baby's foreskin.
Yeah, so the foreskin is fused to the head of the glands. What they're suggesting you do is known as forced retraction, and it's very painful. It's the equivalent of like if you had to pull your fingernail off to clean under it. The saying is only clean what is seen. People bring malpractice lawsuits for doctors who do that, and I've heard of some people trying to do essentially a sexual assault lawsuit, because if you touch that part of the body without consent and do something harmful, it does fall into that category. Forced retraction is weird because there's no medical profit motive for it, right? It is just misinformation, and it is just harm. And it's one of the things that makes me think that this is not just, a lot of people will debate, like, why does this continue? Is it a financial thing? Is it something else? And it really does make me think that it's a cultural and power dynamic, not just a financial one, because there's no financial reason to do that. It's actually a financial liability for them to engage in malpractice that way. And yet there are situations where they're essentially trying to gain power over the child's body in that way, and it doesn't profit them to do it. And so it's a very strange system and response, and it'd be so easy to correct, right? Like, do you just tell doctors, well, this is what you do instead? And yet that misinformation is still persisting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, for mamas and fathers who are listening, if you have an intact son, you do not retract it. I mean, we even had to look it up how how to take care of our son's penis,
Right.
and it stays fused for until what age?
For a lot of kids, it doesn't change until puberty, because it doesn't have to, right? It's like that is meant to cover and protect that part of the body, and the reason for it to become mobile isn't it isn't until it's being used in sexuality in some way. So that's the reason it moves, is for that purpose. Until then, it can stay covering and it's totally fine. And even then, like, there's ways, if it's not moving in puberty, like there's ways of changing that don't involve any kind of cutting or any damage of any kind. So the simple advice to give to parents is only clean what is seen. But again, like, that's part of the challenge of changing culture, that people are sort of in a culture that doesn't necessarily support that norm.
I want to spread the word, and we have social media and motherhood circumcision, male genital cutting, male genital mutilation is part of motherhood, because we
Yeah,
are the protectors of our children. Fathers are the protectors of the family. And so I think it's just so important to spread the word that it's not necessary.
I agree. Going back to what I said earlier, the word of the truth of it is very simple. Just your children are perfect the way they are. There's nothing we need to do. It's the disentangling of all the different cultural things that gets challenging. And it sounds like your acquaintance who got very upset with you has some cultural things to disentangle that they might need to look at for themselves before they can hear what you have to say.
Yeah, and it's funny because that's what happens when people who are offended or insulted are trying to control the language.
It's
Go ahead.
very blaming language. It's you are, right? Not I feel. Like I think if that person could use nonviolent language in that situation, they would say, I feel really threatened by what you just said. Um, this thing feels really important to me. It feels like a big part of my culture. And you criticizing it in that way feels like a criticism of me to me. Um, and that they sort of see themselves not as separate from the practice or that culture, but like it's an I am statement, right? Um, People when they speak about their identity, they say I am. So I am a man, or I am a woman, I am Jewish, right? Like that's an identity level thing. And then when people talk about circumcision, they'll say I am circumcised or I'm not. And that's really bizarre too, because you don't say that about any other surgery or medical practice. You don't say like I am home birth, or like I am shoulder surgery, or all of these other
Or
things.
I am mastectomy or
Right. And
hysterectomy.
so it becomes an identity when it's actually just something that happened to you. And I think that even something like Jewish identity is something that you can change or separate from. In other words, when someone gets really threatened by that, I think that often they feel like they are that identity, and then that identity is inseparable from this other thing. And so criticism of the thing is criticism of them. And because they aren't aware of the criticism, oh, anything that you say about bad about this has to come from, hate or something like that. Or like criticism, this thing is so precious and special to me that any criticism of it must be bad. And there's sort of a rose tinted glasses of like, my culture has never had any errors of any kind. Um, and identity is a trap. You know, if you get really involved in identity of any kind, it makes people do things that they don't necessarily. Well, you have to do this because you are this, right? Like, well, when you were born into a particular culture or body or gender or race, like, does that come with that you have to do anything or any particular thing? But that's kind of how identity works. Like, you have to do this because you are this. And some of these social constructs are shared in the sense that like the definition the larger world has might be one thing, but you can choose whether you're a part of them or not. And so if someone's threatened by that, I feel like they need to look at what they actually believe their identity is. Like, is your identity such that you have to cut body parts off of children? um is that an identity that you want to keep, or is that an identity that you want to change in some way? uh and if you're upset by someone, because I assume when you talked about this, you probably weren't talking about any particular race, religion, anything like that. um it takes an incredible narcissism to look at someone else making a statement like that and then say, oh, this must be about me and my identity, right? um which it
Mm-hmm.
isn't, and
Mm-hmm.
that trigger, that I mean, like I said, the challenge of this is that when we're the truth is very simple, and then when we're disentangling all of the myths, disentangling someone's identity and the ideas that they have about that, is incredibly challenging, especially when it's that identified and interlinked with their self-perception. And it's something where I've experienced that too. I've heard of a lot of other activists. I think it's one of the things that scares people from talking about this, is that they don't want to be perceived as picking on any particular identity, whether it's like circumcised men or Jewish people or Muslim people or whoever. And that reaction is often more about them than it is about the people who are just saying, hey, you can love your kids just the way that they are.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's when I get, negative comments, it is people are so triggered. Like I'm looking at them saying, "Hey,
Yeah.
I'm talking to you." So it is really interesting. And I love that point that you make about identity. And we seem like it's a concept. It's just a concept.
And it's fluid to the point where like your relatives, who I assume they're not American. Are
Nope.
they? Have they?
They're
Okay.
Thai, born and raised in Thailand. Yeah.
Yeah. So they're not American, and they're adopting identity and cultural constructs from a completely different culture just because they like it. That's what they think is interesting. And every culture does that to a certain degree. So there are people in the United States who, um, like love things about Chinese culture or Asian culture or all sorts of other different things, and they make that their identity. And um, I saw a video recently of people in Japan who basically cosplay as people from the old West. Like the people do this all the time. Identity is actually not that fixed. You can change it at any point you want. And so uh yeah, it's one of those things where if the culture or values that you're a part of aren't serving you, like you can change. And a big change is often easier than a smaller one.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell me what your show is about? Your podcast, the Brendon Marotta Show? What's
Oh
the
man,
topics?
so I called it the Brendon Marotta Show because I wanted it to be about whatever I felt like anytime I was doing a podcast. And I knew if I named it after anything else that I would have to start a new podcast in a couple years when I got developed new interests, which I'm glad I did, because the focus has really been on the issues of my film and my book, of children's issues, really broad range, everything from intellectual stuff, like we did an episode on the history of human rights, and some stuff on the boarding school system in the UK, and the impact that's had historically on evolutionary biology and how you raise children, all sorts of different things. And then of course now I'm getting interested in AI stuff, and I might have some people on that. And the last episode we did was on effective altruism. But it's really like I am someone who becomes fascinated by things very easily, and I read a lot, as you might have noticed by my background. Um, and so I wanted a space to have any conversation I wanted with the most interesting people I could find. And uh, I had no idea what to call it. And so I just used my name.
I love
And
that.
I justified it by the fact that the model from I was using for podcasting was Tim Ferriss and Joe Rogan, both of whom have a podcast that's just their name. Like,
Yes.
okay, well, I'll just do that. And then, I won't, if I call it the children's issues show, and then I would, in a couple of years, I won't have to rename it the AI show or the art and filmmaker show, or I can just mix it in whatever I feel like is interesting.
Oh, that's a
So,
great idea. Yeah, I
I
love that.
mean, like, it's, you say that, but also everyone asks, so what's your podcast about? And I'm like, whatever I feel like. It's not very
Yeah.
good marketing focus.
But
It's
it's
just
interesting to know your what you're passionate about right now. And when you said evolutionary biology, I was like, yes, like that's I love that stuff, from how we are born, how we parent, our instinct, survival.
Yeah.
I always look back at how we used to eat and live and move from that perspective. So yeah, well, do you have any projects happening? Any new projects going on, or is it just the podcast that you're working on right now?
So the biggest thing I do now is I have a Substack called www.hegemonmedia.com. I'm doing a lot of sort of follow-up articles around the book I did, Children's Justice. That's probably the best place to follow. And it's interesting, the Substack is basically an email newsletter. So instead of getting a whole book at once, you get articles, once every so often, and some of them are subscription paid, and most of them are free. So that's kind of the main thing. And then right now I have like 7 different projects that are all in various stages, and I'm going to do whichever one gets the most traction first. The articles that are in Hegemon Media will probably eventually become a new book. There's something I'm trying to get the film rights for, but we'll see if that happens. And I might do an audiobook version. Oh wait, actually the last book I put out was all AI art. There's that.
Okay.
I've been getting very interested in that. It was a book completely unrelated to everything we've been talking about, but I'll pitch it, and if you think it's too unrelated to everything, you can edit it out of the podcast, and I'll be totally fine with it. But it's a book called The Gods of AI, and so I got really interested in AI art image generators back in November of last year. And of course, AI is everywhere now, but back then it was less everywhere. And I was putting sort of I developed this thesis that basically like these AI image generators are trained on every image humans have produced, like everything.
Whoa.
And so if you put in something abstract, like you prompt them really directly and say, I want a picture of this type of person in this environment, and and it'll draw that for
Whoa,
you.
I had no idea.
Wait, you didn't know about AI image generators?
No.
Oh, oh, you can you can type and it will create any image for you.
Wow.
That's the short version. So
Okay.
I did like 20,000 pieces of art with the one in 2 months, and I edited it down to 400 pages of the best stuff, and that's a book called The Gods of AI. And the way that I did that is I would put really abstract things in them. So instead of telling it exactly what I want to draw, I put like the god of language, and just see what it drew for that. And so it would draw from, through its training, it's got every image that might pertain to God or language, and it would create something from that. So I'd get this image of like sort of a ghostly wise old man rising out of a book, and that's what it would do for them. Like, that's really interesting. And so then I would ask it, it sort of used it as like an oracle, like, well, what does the divine version of this concept look like for humanity? And it was interesting because you'd learn things, right? So if you put in it asked it to create an image of heaven. Heaven is empty white clouds based on its images of every you know every image that humanity has ever created. And then hell is just crowds of people. And I think it's really telling that like we can't imagine heaven with other people, but hell is other people essentially. And that's
I
probably
love
why we haven't
that.
been able to create heaven on earth, because we don't know what it looks like with other people.
Yeah.
So the book is sort of a like exploration of human psychology and spirituality through these really beautiful images.
Really cool. That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
And that makes
Thank
me
you.
even think to even if I were to search birth, I hope it's not a hospital setting.
But that would tell you something, right?
Yeah.
That would tell you something about human consciousness, what images we've produced of birth. If because you as a human being can only see so many images in your life, but I could train a data set of images that's greater than you've ever looked at your entire life. And so if going through that, it produces certain images when you tell it birth, that tells you something about like the collective consciousness of humanity, and what, or at least our collective visual consciousness, right? Of what people have produced.
I'm glad you mentioned your new book. That sounds great, because I had no idea that you could do that. So thank you for sharing that.
So this is what I mean by multi-interest. Is there's other stuff I'm doing that might be totally unrelated to my first film. The next project might be a novel, we'll see, but
Awesome.
a lot of different stuff.
Yeah, thank you so much. Is there one last thing that you could tell mothers and fathers? Advice. You're a father. One advice.
Well, if you haven't had kids yet, or if you're going to have a new kid soon, this is not affiliate. This is literally just the best thing I've ever tried. The Dunstan baby language course is amazing. Have you heard of this?
No.
So this woman who's an opera singer noticed that infants make certain shapes with their mouth when they're feeling certain things. So when the child yawns, their mouth makes a certain shape, and that makes a certain sound. And that means the child is tired. So there's a universal sound, every culture, every child, for tired. There's one for hungry, because when they were going to put their mouth on the nipple, they make it like sort of an O shape. And if you learn this and you listen to your child's sounds, you can know what they're asking for when they're an infant before they have language. And it was scary how accurate this was with our son. And it was great because they'll make the sound quiet before they start, screaming and getting upset, right? Because you think about, they're like, "Mom, Dad, I'm hungry. I'm hungry. I'm hungry." And then like, like that's when it comes, when they've been asking you to do something over and over and you haven't been listening. So if you listen early, there's a lot less crying and things like that and upsetness. And it was crazy how accurate it was. So they, we just hear a little sound. "Oh, you're hungry. Okay." Simple. So that I highly recommend.
What's it called again? It's a book?
The Dunstan Baby Language course. It's like a video course.
Oh, wow.
And then the other thing that was really useful before we became parents was knowing that children will set you up to feel how they feel. So if the child is upset, they'll make you feel upset. If the child feels powerless, they'll make you feel powerless. If the child's happy, I mean, kids are wonderful to be around when they're happy. They make you feel really happy, right? So if you just notice how you're feeling, your child is probably feeling the same thing. And you can sort of use that also as a clue to understand your child's feelings. I think those are the two biggest things. I don't know. I went into parenting, hearing all the stories about how you wouldn't get sleep early on and things like that. And so I went into it like with the sort of, I'm going to embrace whatever this comes with, and was pleasantly surprised that it wasn't as bad as everyone said. So, have fun. It'll be a great ride.
I love that. It's not as bad as society says it is.
It really isn't. I think a lot of it too is like, if you like someone does a hospital birth and then they traumatize them there, and then they traumatize them in the womb, and they traumatize them through food they're eating, and then do circumcision and a whole bunch of other stuff, like they're not going to be a happy camper. And then like, wow, this is really difficult. It's like, yeah, like, whereas our son's been wonderful. He's the best. But I think it's also, my wife will sometimes be like, "Why does he love me so much?" And I'm like, "Because you do everything for him." Like, why would he not love you? Are you, she's like, "I don't understand it." And I'm like, "I love you, sweetheart, but I think I do understand it."
That's so sweet. By the way, you are the first dude that I've interviewed.
Oh my goodness.
So congratulations.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much again for being on Mother Freedom. And everyone, if you want to watch American Circumcision, you could find it on where, Brendon?
Circumcisionmovie.com.
Okay. Check it out. It's very insightful.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.